standardly take place in Latin America. One crucial difference is the United States didn't carry it out. That's not a small point. Furthermore, the United States did not at least openly support it. It was overwhelmingly opposed, not only in the hemisphere, but throughout the world. I mean, just about every European and Latin American countries immediately withdrew their ambassadors. The Organization of American States unanimously condemned it. The United States kind of went along, tepidly, but it went along. Didn't withdraw its ambassador. It did not use the influence it surely has. The officer corps, they're trained in the School of the Americas. They're all closely linked to the United States. The U.S. uses a military base there, overall a military base, overwhelming economic leverage. It didn't use it. There was partially used it, but not much. In fact, commentary here is sort of split between condemning the coup and condemning Zelaya. When he came back to the Brazilian embassy a couple of week or so ago, the U.S. there was an OAS, Organization of American States meeting, but the U.S. ambassador kind of surprised everyone by mostly condemning Zelaya and not saying much about the coup. Well, all of that is a signal that the U.S. is kind of joining the hemisphere and the world on this, but in a limited way. But that's a big change, because up until this point, the coups are U.S. initiated, or certainly U.S. backed, almost invariably. I mean, in this millennium, there have been 3 coups, 3 military coups. There was a military coup in 2002 in Venezuela, which overthrew the government, dismantled the parliament, threw out the Supreme Court. The U.S. backed it, as usual. It was overturned very quickly. Within a couple of days, there was a popular uprising which overturned it, and the U.S. had to kind of back off, but it then turned to subversion. It's called democracy promotion. It's really a form of subversion, undermining the elected government. The second coup was 2 years later in Haiti. The United States and France basically invaded the country, kidnapped the president, sent him off to Central Africa, and instituted a reign of terror. Well, the United States and France are the 2 traditional torturers of Haiti, so not a big surprise. Now, that was after the U.S. had blocked desperately needed economic aid, done all sorts of things to undermine the government. So that's the second coup. This is the third coup. And it's a little different from the others. And I think it reflects 2 things. One thing it reflects is a change that's been going on in Latin America, a very significant change. In the last decade, Latin America, for the first time in its history, since the European conquests, 500 years, is moving towards integration. Slowly, laboriously, but it is developing relations among the countries and even institutions, like the Union of South American Nations and the Bank of the South and others, which are significant. Integration is a prerequisite for independence. It means the countries can't be picked off one after the other. And they're also beginning to move towards addressing some of their internal problems, which are horrifying. The worst inequality in the world, and it's rich areas, but the wealth is very narrowly concentrated, a huge, massive misery. The ruling elites are Europeanized, mostly white, closely linked to the United States, and they're being slowly pushed to the side. They don't like it, of course, and there's all sorts of reactions, but it's happening. Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, kind of in the lead. Brazil's doing it a different way, Argentina too, and so on. In fact, there's really no one out of this in South America except for Colombia, the one U.S. base. Well, the U.S. is, and that's one of the reasons why there was such strong, overwhelmingly strong reaction to the Honduran coup. The other reason, I think, is domestic. And it has to do with that question earlier about what young people can do. What young people mostly were doing in the 60s and since has simply raised the costs of aggression by the United States. The United States is not in a position to overthrow governments the way it was in the past. Actually, Brazil is an important case. Again, as I say, you read the newspapers this morning, you see a lot of praise for Lula as the great moderate. Well, you know, Lula's policies are not all that different from those of President Goulart in the early 60s, kind of reformist positions. Well, back in the early 60s, the U.S. reacted to that. The Kennedy administration organized a military coup, took place right after Kennedy's assassination, which instituted the first neo-Nazi style national security state in Brazil, murderous, brutal state, and Brazil's an important country, so that kind of spread, you know. Following years, it was just like a plague of repression over South America in the 80s, Central America, worse than anything in their history. Well, that was then. And now the United States is not in a position to do that. Just as it was not in a position to, say, in the invasion of Iraq, it couldn't use the tactics that Kennedy and others and his successors used in Vietnam. Can't do that anymore. There's too much opposition here. Countries become more civilized. Plenty of horrible things go on, but there's a break, there's a limit. They didn't carry out saturation bombing by B-52s in Iraq. They didn't carry out chemical warfare the way Kennedy did to destroy crops, try to drive ultimately millions of people into concentration camps. Those tactics are no longer acceptable. So there are changes, and people here have contributed partially to those changes, and they're important. Now, the game isn't over. You know, the traditional rulers and the ruling superpower don't give up. They're continuing to struggle in other ways. So the United States now a couple of weeks ago, the United States was kicked out of its last military base in South America, in Manta, in Ecuador. But it's the Obama administration has just arranged for use of 7 new military bases in Colombia, and a week ago 2 new ones in Panama, which is pretty much a U.S. dependency. The U.S. Fourth Fleet, it's the fleet that covers South America and the Caribbean waters. That was disbanded in 1950, but it was reactivated last year. It's now there. The Colombian military bases caused enough of us opposition in South America, so there was a meeting of UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, in Argentina a couple of weeks ago to deal with the question, and they expressed considerable concern. There was almost no support for it, very little. Brazil, the major country, pretty strongly objected. The leading opposition was Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the ALBA countries. But they also, an important document surfaced at that meeting, which I don't think has been reported here. It's from last March or so, an Air Force document saying that the bases in Colombia, internal U.S. document, military document, saying the bases in Colombia can be used for surveillance and the coordination of military activities throughout the continent, and furthermore that they are part of an international basically intervention system that extends to Africa and the rest of the world. They could be linked up to that, and it's part of, it's an analog to, it's part of the U.S. system of military bases all over the world. This is the surveillance and coordination aspect. That's what it can be used for. Well, that stirred up a lot of concern at the UNASUR meeting, and supposedly their defense military committee is looking into it. It's the kind of thing we ought to be concerned with. Training of Latin American officers has sharply increased. They are now being trained to deal with what's called radical populism. populism. We're back to the mafia principle. We can't permit independent forces that are committed to the people of the country, not to our interests. All of that is reaction, but it's kept quiet. The U.S. can't carry out the kind of